Kia ora and welcome back to Wellywood Wargaming. My name is Damon and we are here to talk about Necromunda. So in this episode I did say that I was going to go through all of the gangs, all of the available playable factions, so to speak, in Necromunda. And I'm starting with the non-house gangs actually. So in the first video I did Outcasts, and in this video I thought it would only be natural to do Venators actually. So here we go. This is going to be your guide to Venators in Necromunda, and let's get into it. So what is a Venator in Necromunda? I suppose that's worth explaining. And how do they differ from Outcasts? Now, I have to draw lots of comparisons to the Outcasts in a lot of ways because there are many similarities. However, there are also some real key differences here as well. But the main thing, obviously, to describe Venators is that they are a group of elite bounty hunters, almost a crack squad sent into the Underhive to bring back bounties and things like that. Now, they can be played in a number of different ways, but the main differences from an Outcast gang is that they are far, far more elite. What I mean is they have access to much better equipment, they're more expensive, and they have a much smaller crew size generally than Outcasts. That is the key difference between the two. Why would you want to play Venators? I would say because if you're like me and you're someone who's really into the hobby and really into the modeling and painting side of things, and you want full customization of your miniatures, then Venators are for you. Now, where do they fit in the game narratively? From a narrative perspective, I would say that they are exactly what I described. They're a group of bounty hunters. So if you want to play that elite, real elite, hardcore, heavy-hitting, small squad type of gang, then this is for you. In terms of the style of play, though, you can't really put your finger on it because they are quite variable in the way that you can start them. They don't have a house list. They have access to the trading post and certain rarity values depending on whether it is a leader, champion, or ganger. And we're going to go into that now. But your gang composition, we'll go into that now. It's quite different from other gangs in that we don't have super champions, we don't have juves. You only really have 3 fighter types. Now, those 3 fighter types are, again, pretty variable. So we'll start with the hunt leader here. So your hunt leader is 110 credits, which is pretty reasonable for a leader generally in Necromunda. Now, your hunt leader has 4 profiles you can choose from. So you pay 110 credits and you get one of the 4 following profiles. Now, these are all pretty different, and there are, you know, they can match certain miniatures and certain play styles and certain shenanigans that you want to get up to. But here are the 4 key profiles. Now this carries on through the gang, and you also have the same 4 profiles for each champion and ganger too. And they all have their own sort of quite strong defined theme as well. So with the hunt leader, you have a generic profile. Now this is what I'm going to describe as a generic profile. Now this is Hunt Leader 1. And Hunt Leader 1 has pretty average stats actually. So compared to some other leaders, it's not as good. We have a movement 5, weapon skill, ballistic skill 3, I believe. Toughness, strength 3, 2 attacks, 2 wounds. But the main thing that stands out with Venators here is obviously we have really good mental stats. Now what I mean by mental stats is your leadership, cool, willpower, and intelligence. On this particular generic one, it is good, but it's not the best of the 4. However, we have really high cool throughout the gang, and I'm going to go into that a bit more detail soon. But this is the most easiest, I suppose, to begin with profile. It's the most straightforward one, and it's the one that you're probably going to be used to. For a sort of generic leader profile, it's similar to, say, a Delac leader or an Escher leader in some ways, or even an Orlok leader. It's just minus the extra wounds and attacks that you might get with those ones. So it's okay. The next one is I'm going to call it the squat profile. The reason why I call it the squat profile is that it has the stats of what I would describe as a squat or space dwarf, if you're not familiar with Warhammer 40k. Now, squats are obviously going to be released pretty soon, squat mining expedition gangs. And I have, prior to this, actually run a Venator squat gang with every single person in the gang, every gang member having this profile. Now, I would not recommend it. I'll go into more details on that as well, but here is your squat profile. Now, squats only have a movement of 3. So movement 3 is problematic in most situations, particularly on 3D terrain. Charging is difficult, moving up and down levels, stairs, platforms, things like that is difficult. However, you can make them a shooting platform and not have to move much, but trust me, movement is quite an important stat in Necromunda, and movement 3 across the board is just horrific. So don't do it. You might want to do it, and it's fun for about a game, but trust me, after a while you'll get really sick of it. The other stats for the squat, however, it does have high toughness, so we're looking at a toughness 4 here. It's also got really high cool and really high mental stats. In fact, I think the mental stats for the squat are higher than the other 4 profiles. In general, it has the best willpower out of the 4 as well, so that can be used for psychic powers and stuff too. So having high willpower in this game now with some of the stuff that affects the willpower stat is really good. But also, of course, it has got that low movement to think about. So yeah, just bear that one in mind. The next one I'm going to call the combat profile. Now, it's pretty obvious what the combat profile is for the hunt leader. This is hunt leader 3. Now, this one has a clear focus on strength and toughness, both being 4. It has the same amount of attacks and wounds as the other profiles, but of course it has a much better weapon skill with the strength and toughness as well there too. Now, something that is worth mentioning is that this one does have a really high cool stat with 4 or 5, I believe, off the top of my head, but it has low sort of mental stats in the other departments. It has low intelligence and low willpower. So if you were to make your leader into a psyker, which is possible, I'm going to go into that in a minute, then this would probably not be the optimal choice for that psychic leader. However, you can still do it, and willpower increases are cheap as we go through the game, so worth thinking about too in terms of long campaign structure. So that's the combat profile, and the last profile I'm going to call the Shooty Profile. So this is your sort of Vansar-like-ish profile. So of course we've got very, very high ballistic skill with a 2+, and we've got quite low weapon skill for a leader of only 4+. Low movement of 4, so very similar to a Vansar here, if you're familiar with Vansar. And we have obviously only 1 attack as well, so not geared towards close combat. The other leaders all have 2 attacks in close combat, but we have really, really high mental stats across the board for this one as well, with very high intelligence, cool, willpower, leadership, etc. too. Now, just as I mentioned before, you can make your hunt leader into a psyker, and all that does is it's 35 credits to do so, and you can give them a psychic power from creation or later on in a campaign should you need. Now, the good thing about doing that is, firstly, psychic powers are now really good with Book of the Outcast. We've got lots and lots of choice in terms of the psychic powers, and also 3 of those 4 profiles for the leader have got really high willpower, so it's definitely a very, very viable solution. I would say that the squat profile has the best willpower, I think, but again, like any of them are good. The combat profile has a willpower of 8 though, so probably not quite so good. But yeah, 35 credits essentially for another skill on creation is incredibly valuable, and yeah, that's quite a lot of credits, but it will be worth it if you pick a good psychic power there as well. So moving on now, that's the hunt leader. Just another thing as well, and I touched on it earlier, in terms of equipment, weapons, and war gear, Venators get access to the trading post rarity roll. So your leader has access to rarity 11 and below in terms of the equipment that you can give them. Now, rarity 11 is very, very high, so it's much higher than say outcasts and stuff who get rarity 9, I believe, on the generic leader. Rarity 11 can give you some really, really cool stuff. Now, Venators are one of those gangs that you're going to need arbitration for. If you're in a campaign, you're probably going to want to talk to your arbitrators about perhaps some details that you could iron out, because when you look at the Venator list, it is quite vague, and there is room for, asking your arbitrator if you can do things with the psychic powers, with skills, things like that, whether you can give them other things. Also in terms of illegality as well, if you are Venators, can you get access to illegality, you know, black market trading post stuff? That's kind of up in the air. I would say yes, but again, ask your arbitrator for consent on that stuff. Don't just go for it. So moving forwards onto the Hunt Champion there though, we've got really similar stuff going on here. So these guys are 85 credits and they get rarity 10 and below in terms of the equipment that they get. And we're looking at the same 4 profiles pretty much, with your generic one being pretty generic really, your squat profile being very slow but very tough, your close combat profile being very much like a Goliath, and your shooty profile again having that really high ballistic skill and shooty stuff. The other thing that's worth mentioning, of course, is that we've got house legacies as well. Now what house legacies are is for 30 credits you can give any of your fighters in a Venator gang a house legacy. Now what that does is it's 30 credits, so it's quite expensive, but it gives that fighter access to that house's equipment list. So say for example you had a leader and you give them a Delac house legacy, you will be able to get all of the stuff from the Delac house list, meaning that you will be able to get web gauntlets, flechette pistols, etc, etc. Now that's quite good if you want to do that, but most of the time if you're playing Venators you're probably just going to go with those rarity rolls, because 30 credits just for access to something that you're probably almost going to get access to something similar or better than is worth considering. 30 credits is quite a lot on an already expensive gang, but you can totally do it. Say for example you did Van Saar, then you get those armoured undersuits and slightly better armour, things like that, and lots of las and energy weapons slightly cheaper. So you can offset the cost of that 30 credits by getting cheaper equipment. For example, you've got Escher las guns are 5 credits for example, so you're getting cheaper las guns. So yeah, you can do some shenanigans with that stuff as well. The other thing, moving on actually, is just moving on to the Hunter. Now the Hunter is 50 credits. Now this is your ganger. Now you can have a specialist, unlike Outcasts, I believe. So that does mean that one of these Hunters can have special weapons as well and level up like a specialist too. Now these are 50 credits, which is quite a lot for a ganger, but some of the other gang fighters in houses are also the same sort of cost. But they are more of an elite gang, so you're looking at slightly better equipment generally anyway. However, the rarity value is 8 or less for the gangers, which is higher than a Hive Scum of 7, but it's not particularly high, so you can get some pretty nifty stuff, but rarity 8 is not that great, and that's where your house legacy might come in. So it's worth thinking about that. Again though, just bear in mind that having a house legacy on a ganger makes them naked 80 credits, which is an awful lot of cash in Necromunda. So there you have it. Now the other thing about all these fighters in the Venator gang is that they get access to all the skills basically. So when you create a Venator, whether it is a hunt leader, a hunt champion or a hunter, you can choose what their skill sets are. So for your leader, you get to choose 4 skill sets. So for your leaders, and you get leadership skills off the bat, you get to choose 2 primary skill sets and 2 secondary skill sets. So you can really design these guys how you like. For example, you could take ferocity and agility, 2 of my favorite skill trees on a leader, and your secondary ones could be, say, savant and cunning. So that's completely doable. Of course, bear in mind that secondary skills don't really come into play in campaigns much. It's quite hard to obtain them. They're often random. So pick your 2 primary skill sets very wisely. And I imagine most of the time with Venators, you're probably going to be taking Iron Will on your leader just because of the small crew size. So bear that in mind too. So I'm going to move on to the next bit now, and that is talking about the sort of strengths and weaknesses of the gang. Of course, this is going to be quite a short video next to all the other house gangs because there isn't a huge amount to talk about. It's only a single page in the rulebook, but I'm going to give you some examples of what you can do with these gangs as well. But talking about the strengths and weaknesses, I think this is something that needs to be explained here. So in terms of the strength, one of the key strengths of Venators here is that you've got an incredibly high cool stat throughout the gang. Now all the gangers, no matter what profile you choose, have a cool of 6+, which is insanely good compared to most gangs. So that means that you have generally got quite an expensive elite crew, but with that high cool stat, it does mean that if you bottle, which is quite likely, you're going to end up sticking around a bit more. Now, last campaign, if you've watched any of our gang battle reports, you'll notice that Rory's gang only had 4 or 5 fighters in some games and quite often stuck around till the bitter end, and that was quite cool. And I think that's about right for a group of elite bounty hunters. They should have a really good cool stat. So there we go on that. So the cool stat is very, very high throughout the gang, generally. They also get access to very elite equipment. So, I mean, as mentioned before, rarity 11 and below for your leader is insanely good, and then you can combine that with your house legacies as well to get even more access to harder to get equipment as well, things that are exclusive just to those house lists. Of course, skill access, as I mentioned before, is a huge part of wanting to play Venators. You get to add full customization to your skills out of the box. And you can do some really, really cool things with skill combinations that you can't do with other fighters. For example, you know, Escher are very agile and they got all the agility skills and combat skills and stuff, but they don't get access to, say, ferocity or cunning and things like that. So you can here, you know, combine cunning with agility, and you can combine ferocity with savant, for example. Lots of combinations that you can't do with other gangs. Those are just some examples. You know, you could have a brawn and savant primary skill combination on someone. I mean, that's kind of peculiar, but you could totally do it. So those options are there for you. The other thing that you get as Venators, because you're a group of bounty hunters, when you take a captive at the end of the game, if you do capture a rival gang member, you get to sell them to the guilders for their full credit value, and instead of half, which is pretty cool. You also get half the value if you kill a fighter outright. So if you're playing against a gang, one of their fighters actually dies, not only do you get the XP for that, but you will also get half of the cost rounded up to the nearest 5 credits for that fighter, which is a nice little extra there. And sometimes that just happens randomly, and you go, oh, okay, I've got some cash for this. This is nice. But the biggest thing about Venators and the biggest strength about Venators isn't so much about how they play on the table. It's if you're like me and you're into the hobby and you're into the customization, you're into painting, modeling, then Venators are the best gang for this. I'll show you some picture examples of some Venator gangs that I've made in the past with my Guardians of the Galaxy or Guardians of the Underhive gang, of course, which I did years and years ago. I've also done a gang that was themed on the 7 Deadly Sins, for example. I've done all sorts of Venator gangs, and I'm probably going to end up running Venators again next campaign with a full inquisitorial warband. So if you're into your Dan Abnett books and you're into inquisitors and stuff, then Venators fit that mold really, really well with a sort of warband, inquisitor warband and stuff. So you can do that too. So moving on to the weaknesses, I would say that Venator weaknesses is that they're very expensive, particularly if you go with those house legacies and making them psychers, things like that. But they're supposed to be expensive. They are an elite gang, so you're looking at the same sort of cost and the same sort of crew number as maybe a Van Saar gang, but it really does depend how you want to build them. You can, of course, build them slightly cheaper. Just because you get access to those high rarity, more expensive things doesn't mean you have to take them, but it is kind of the point. If you want to play the same sort of customization or a similar sort of customization and narrative aspect, but with a load of cheap bodies, then I would suggest playing Outcasts, because they are far more cheaper and far less elite. So that's one weakness about Venators. The other thing is obviously the crew size is generally going to be quite small. Like I mentioned before, though, that is kind of offset by the high cool, but when you do bottle, you do lose rep, and that's worth thinking about. Because if you do have a small crew, you're quite likely to bottle in most games, but you are likely to stick around as well. Similar to Goliaths in a lot of ways, not as insanely cool as the Goliaths though. So that's worth thinking about. You're always going to be outnumbered and usually out-activated as well. Now, activation economy in Necromunda is something I've talked about a lot. And if you're into the game and you're a tactical-minded person, you will see quite quickly that Necromunda can be won sheerly on numbers and out-activating your opponent. And that happens quite a lot with elite Venator squads that get outnumbered playing, say, Corridor 2-1 or 3-1 or something like that. So usually, where there are more fighters, it's usually the gang that has the higher numbers that tends to win more often than not. So that's just my opinion and my experience on playing this game. But there you go. So yeah, small crew numbers is definitely a weakness, I would say. The other thing I would say, which is kind of a downer, is that they don't have dedicated tactics cards. They only have one tactics card, which is actually exclusive for Venators. It's a very good one, but they don't get any other exclusive tactics cards like all of the other gangs do, even Outcasts actually, which have the best deck in the game now, to be honest. But there you go. That's some of the weaknesses there. The other one I would say is that they're not particularly beginner friendly. What I mean is that if you're new to the game, it's probably not best playing Venators because there are a lot of details and stats to keep track of, and also just having that trading post access can be a little bit daunting at first because there are so many weapons and equipment in the game to choose from. So I think if you're starting the game, then Venators aren't for you, just because of the amount of details and stats that you've got to keep track of. And they're not particularly forgiving gang to play most of the time either, just because of those reasons that I've highlighted as well, with the small crew size, etc., etc. So there you go. Those are some of the strengths and weaknesses for Venators. So rounding up, really, again, this is quite a quick video because it's not a very fleshed out gang, but they are most definitely one of my favorite gangs in Necromunda, and certainly for the modeling and playing aspect of it anyway. But they're really, really awesome for experienced players because you can really challenge yourself and just do a very fun, fluffy gang. And yeah, just great for sort of narrative play as well. If you really want to give your gang a real story and a real vibe and a real aesthetic, then this is the gang for you. And they're perfect for kit bashers and hobbyists. Or you can do anything with this gang. You can make a gang of beastmen. You can do whatever you want with it. Just the same as you can with Outcasts, except you've got even more options here, because even just your generic gangers have their own stats and their own house legacies and their own skill sets and stuff too. So there you go, that's Venators. And that's pretty much all I'm going to say on that. The rain has started coming down here in the garage, so I'm going to be playing another game tonight against my mate Selby. This is our first encounter this campaign, so I'm looking forward to shooting that later on. But yeah, I'm going to end up doing a video of every single gang in the game. I just thought that it would be too normal to go with the house gangs first, so I'm actually going to work my way backwards, I think. So we're probably going to be doing Ogrins soon. That will be exciting, and we're probably going to be doing Genestealer Cult as well, and some of the other gangs too, like your Chaos Helots and Corpse Grinders and whatnot. But there you go, there you have it. That's Venators for you. I'm going to put some pictures up, like I said, of some of the gangs that I've made, and you can have a goosey gander at those. But I hope that answers a lot of questions about Venators. If anybody has got any questions, then please comment down below. And of course, like, share, subscribe, and keep me going on this, because I love this game with all my heart. So if this is good for you and you're enjoying these videos, then long may it continue. And that's it from me. Peace out.